Hi everybody, we're back to talk more about dog food. This is part 2 in the series on feeding your dog. The first part focused on what to feed your dog or some tips on finding a good dog food. This part will concern itself with how much to feed your dog. That's another question that I'm asked all the time. Well, obviously the difference between dry food and wet food is going to be tremendous because there's such a difference in the water content between dry and wet food. As a matter of fact, if you feed dry food, you always have to make sure that the dogs have ready access to fresh water because it is dehydrated. Generally speaking, the amount of wet food that you would feed is probably about 2.5 to 3 times the amount of dry food that you would feed your dog. I'm going to address dry food, but you can always adapt these comments to wet food if you do. The first thing you have to determine is your dog's caloric needs. There is a formula that you can use. There are a couple of formulas. The easier formula you could use is to first get your dog's weight in kilograms. And unless you're in one of those sane countries like the UK where they actually use metric measurements, you would have to take number of pounds and divide by 2.2 to get the weight in kilograms. You multiply that number times 30 and add 70, and that's an average amount of calories that a dog would need per day. And we're talking about an adult dog. Puppies have much higher needs. Just to kind of give you an idea, if you had a 10-pound adult, that comes out to somewhere between 200 and 275 calories per day. A 20-pound dog, about 325 to 400 calories per day. And if you have a larger breed dog, let's say 50 pounds, that would be about 700 to 900 calories per day. And if you give more than that caloric intake, then your dog is going to become overweight. You don't want your dog to become overweight. We'll talk about overweight in just a minute. Then you need to determine what your dog food contains in terms of calories. And that varies, but if you just either locate the information on the bag of dog food, or if that's not available, you can go to the dog food manufacturer's website or any number of other websites that give ratings for calorie content of dog food and find out. A couple of brands that I've used, and I'm not endorsing any brands, believe me. I've used Merrick Adult Food, and that usually has about 350 to 400 calories per cup. I've also used Royal Canin Adult Food, and that's quite a bit lower. The Royal Canin Adult Food is about 330 calories per cup, except for the puppy food, which I do use a lot. I like the micronutrients that I don't have to add, and their puppy food contains about 500 calories per cup. So if I translate that into, let's say, an 18-pound adult Cavalier, which we hope is average, then that 18-pound adult Cavalier is probably going to need something along the lines of about 300 calories per day. So if I'm using Royal Canin Adult, 300 calories per day is about 3/4 of a cup, maybe a little bit more. Whereas if I'm using Merrick, which has a higher calorie content, I'm going to be down below 3/4 of a cup per day. And if the dog is not as active, if the dog is older, if the dog is overweight and I'm trying to shed some pounds, it's going to be down closer to a half cup. And you can't always go by the recommendations that are listed on the bag of dog food. For example, here is the recommendation chart on the bag of Merrick Adult Food that I was just talking about. And you'll see for a 15-pound dog, it recommends 1.25 cups of food per day. And for a 20-pound dog, 1.5 cups per day. That's about double what my dogs actually need. You're much better off figuring out how many calories your dog needs per day and then using the actual calorie content of the food, which is readily accessible. To give you some benchmarks for puppies, because the puppy food is so calorie intensive, For a 10-week-old Cavalier puppy, which would normally weigh about 5 pounds, the calorie needs are somewhere in the neighborhood of about 400 calories per day. Very high because the puppy is experiencing very rapid growth. If I'm using a calorie-intensive puppy food that has like 500 calories per cup, that would mean I'm going to be giving somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe a little bit more than 3/4 of a cup per day, and I would divide that into 2 feedings. At about 6 months old, that puppy might weigh 12 pounds, still undergoing tremendous growth, and the calorie need there goes up to about 500 per day, which means the puppy is going to be getting probably a cup per day, maybe even a little bit more, depending on how active the puppy is. By 1 year old, that puppy might be up to 16 pounds and would need about maybe 600 calories per day. So that's obviously going to be quite a bit more than 1 cup per day. However, right around that 1 year mark, the skeletal growth stops and the nutritional needs drop drastically. So that's when we start transitioning the puppy to an adult food, cut down the feedings to once per day, and we go back to those adult calorie needs that I was just talking about. Now, one more thing that I promised I would talk about, and that's overweight. Bootsy here is a very typical adult, maybe a little bit on the petite side. I would, and I think she's in very, very good condition in terms of her weight. I'll get to you in a minute, Apple, don't worry. The 2 ways I can determine if she's overweight. One is to run my hand along her side here, and I feel her rib cage under a light layer of fat. If you can't feel the rib cage under a light layer of fat, the dog is overweight. I also can put her down on the floor and look down at her, and I should see a narrowing here at the waist. Again, if there's no waistline, if it doesn't come in from the rib cage and back out at the hips, then the dog is overweight. That overweight puts a strain on the dog's heart, and since Cavaliers are somewhat prone to heart disease to begin with, that is a real concern. So you don't want to let your dog be overweight. We noticed that Tag, who's off in the corner sleeping, you can't see her, Tag a few weeks ago was beginning to show some beginning signs of being overweight. So I cut her food down to about maybe a half cup per day, which is going to give her about 200 calories per day, as opposed to the 300 that she would need for ordinary maintenance. And again, if your dog is especially active, those numbers could go up higher. That's just an approximate range. I hope that answers a lot of questions. I know it was a lot of information. If you have any questions, leave a question in the comments section and I'll be happy to get back to you. Meanwhile, Bootsy, good girl, Apple, say goodbye to the nice people.